What is up, you guys? Welcome to the Twink Revolution. I'm Sam.
And I'm Gian. And we're joined by returning guest, Dr. Ashley Frawley. She's a lecturer, a writer, a public speaker, and just all-around swell person. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, thanks for having me on again.
It's sort of funny reflecting back that it's almost exactly a year. I think, we last spoke when all this seemed terribly new, and I think you were mentioning, that maybe you were going to lockdown in the UK. I think there was some looming here, and my goodness, what a year! I guess what I wanted to ask you is, what have we learned, and what's this going to do to us? Like, how do we end? How does the pandemic end? In some sense, like, what's going to be the impact here?
Well, every time there's cause for optimism, it seems to be kind of dialed back, and until we're all just endlessly demoralized. It's a bit worrying because there seems to be an idea that if we just let everyone out of lockdown, economies will bounce back and everything will be fine. I think there's probably an issue that governments are trying to deal with, in that they're going to face massive problems with inflation. And so I am quite concerned about the future. I mean, I was already worried because I had thought that capitalism was heading for another crisis, that we were due for one, because obviously we're not really overcoming our crises, we're not overcoming the underlying, nor can we ever really overcome the underlying tendencies that ultimately lead to crisis within capitalism. And we are just kind of papering over them with more debt, clamoring for more bubbles, which is, what we should do. We shouldn't clamor for the solutions to these crises, which are enormously destructive and horrifying and can lead to things like inter-imperialist war, that kind of thing. So that was my cause for pessimism over the last, decade, that since the 2008 economic crisis, the factors that led to that situation were simply papered over, and so there was another looming crisis. And that, I don't know, I think perhaps the coronavirus has been kind of opportunistically used by businesses and so on to try and get bailouts. One thing that I noticed too is if you look at the lobby groups, so who's lobbying right now, and what are they lobbying for? So if you look at the EU, who's lobbying the EU? What were they lobbying back in March, or when there's a lockdown? What do you think they lobby for? Businesses. Get back to work as quickly as possible? No. It was a gold rush. It was people looking for bailouts. And so I thought perhaps COVID had become an opportunity for them to allow for an extraordinary, maybe devaluation in some cases, in other cases bailouts to avoid being the ones to get screwed, enormous exploitation of the working class, pushing lots of people out of the workplace and then hyper-exploiting the people who are left. So this kind of situation is really scaring me, and what scares me the most is that we seem to not be having that kind of economic discussion. And the idea even that we would raise it is seen as madness. How dare you prioritize the economy over lives and so on? Well, geez, the economy is the basis of our life. That used to be the bread and butter of politics, what we were arguing about. Every worker is an economist by virtue of the struggle of everyday life and trying to eke out your existence. I mean, it's extremely important. Right. And I feel like we've been really disarmed now, where it's like, well, we've become protectors of the vulnerable and of health and risk and so on, and that's all we're able to talk about. But I do worry that we are going to face and are currently facing a serious assault on the part of the capitalist class, and we are not really fighting against it. We're not even talking about it.
Well, and seemingly just sort of welcoming much of that assault with open arms. I mean, if you recall, I'm sure everyone will recall the flatten the curve rhetoric just fell by the wayside about 3 weeks into this, right? I mean, we were all just going to lock down to help with healthcare capacity, protect our precious old people, and somehow the objective moved into either like the culture war says we stay open, it's fake, do nothing, or it suddenly became like even one life is too many. We must just do this forever.
Yeah, I mean, that's really common. I mean, we see a lot of this in modern social movements. So you have like the incremental change. So something that is extremely unpopular and even very damaging, even just a bad policy that you could never get past. You don't start with that. You start with something small that people will accept, and then you use that victory to take the next step. And you see this all the time with all sorts of changes where people, it's just this little thing, it's just this little thing. And then you say, well, what you really want is this. That would never happen. And then, of course, when it happens, it's always, that would never happen. And when it does, you'll deserve it. Like, no, we'll never have police like outlawing protest and that kind of thing. No, gosh. And then it happens, and we deserve it. So there's that incremental kind of change that's really, really common. I forgot now the second part of what you had said.
That was kind of it, I guess. It was the flattening the curve rhetoric kind of fell by the wayside.
Yeah. I guess it's, it was just this, everything that's happened with lockdown has been incremental. It's all of these sorts of things that we wouldn't accept wholesale. Just you kind of get worn down, and eventually you'll accept all sorts of things. And it's worthwhile to just take stock and take perspective every now and then of what we're really being asked to do. And of course, like, it's a public health crisis. The cliche is that it's unprecedented. But I think that we have to be wary of the fact that, I feel like we can be a bit Pollyanna-ish. I mean, capitalists won't think twice about like gunning workers down who go on strike in South America. The idea that all of a sudden it's like, for your own good, you all better just kind of, every single one of you will stay home. I don't know. I am very, I'm suspicious of that. Now, as I said, like, it's certainly necessary. Like, we needed to do something. We need to do something huge. I think we could have directed it better. I think the scattergun approach is extremely damaging. But I also think part of the reason why it became like the way to do things was because at the end of the day, it suited particular people's interests in society and became an opportunity to do all sorts of awful things. And like the two things, I'm not saying that it was, I'm trying to be careful here because I'm not saying that what people did was like this cover for like capitalist crisis. I'm saying it was an opportunity. It was a cynical kind of opportunity, and that's why it happened so easily. Like, if it was really, really an absolute threat to the powers that be, they had to fought way harder to stop it. Right. But of course, like the capitalist class, they're not like, they eat each other alive as well, right? So there are capitalists who fought really, really hard to keep things open, particularly in the United States, because during a crisis, capitalists are fighting not to be the ones that get tossed down into the working class, right? They don't want to be the ones that go out of business, so they were trying as well. So I think there's a lot of struggle going on, and there's also the struggle of actually trying to deal with a health crisis. But you have to think of all of these things within a broader kind of social context, how this becomes an opportunity, and you need to have your critical thinking faculties available to understand how something like this can become an opportunity to do all sorts of things that are undemocratic, unpopular, and very, very bad for the working class.
Right, and it sort of has been interesting, I think, to watch the degree, or to perhaps reflect back on the last year and think that we sort of, our mode of production, right, in particularly like developed Western nations, rich countries, involves, DoorDash and Uber drivers, working as contractors, and then a lot of bullshit jobs, and then clearly some little pockets of production. Well, it seemed like the pockets of production, essential workers, the DoorDash delivery person or whatever, essential, And all the sort of those other sort of bullshit jobs that maybe, could just as well be outsourced, remote, whatever. That's stay home, and it's a moral virtue. I mean, what a perfect opportunity gifted, right, to somebody cynical enough to take advantage of it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what's happening now too is that some of these movements that have gained traction over time have seen, like for instance, UBI. This is potentially a fantastic opportunity for the gig economy, right? Like one of the reasons why a citizen's income was favored by people like Friedrich Hayek was because it's very hard to get people to work for very low wages, for meager wages. And so if you gave people like a positive income tax, a citizen's income, then they have an incentive then to go do these low wage jobs because it's just supplementing their income. And so we are seeing this sort of shift toward capitalism not really being able to sustain its working class anymore, and the state is picking up the tab increasingly, and so it's become this like fantastic opportunity to continue that. Like a load of people have lost secure work, and where did they go? They went straight into the gig economy, and that's only going to grow, and that's terrifying. Like nobody wants that. It's insecure, terrible work. And you're like defined as a contractor, so you don't have any rights and that kind of thing. It's a really, really bad turn for capitalism. I just really worry that we're actually championing it as a solution to what is a very obvious problem that capitalism can't and doesn't want to sustain us anymore. We're just superfluous. That's scary.
There was a really funny tweet that you shared like a few days ago. It was like, you're not working from home. Your home is work, or you're
living at work.
You're working at home.
You're living at work.
You're living at work.
That was Ralph Leonard.
But it really points out this idea that like many corporations have just said we're going to have remote work forever, and how this is saving them billions of dollars because they don't have to pay for offices or all the luxuries associated with, running a business where you can just do it at home. But also, what does it say about, or what does it do to workers themselves, where they're no longer connected to other workers, and now their space that's supposed to be separate from work is now openly available to their bosses? Like, what does that do, and like, what is that going to look like, do you think, after post-COVID?
I think that's a trend that's really scary, because we were already seeing that erosion where your personal opinions that you had in your own life were starting to become the business of your employer. And that kind of division between the public and the private is a key aspect of modernity. Like, and to throw that away is not a good idea, to have, and I've been noticing this with so many things, that this increasing kind of trespass into your personal world, into the world of your opinions, into your bedroom. Like, look, I'm literally working in my bedroom. Like, everybody sees my bed that I sleep in. Like, that's an enormous kind of erosion of the public and private. But it also, like, even the private world of your mind isn't yours anymore. My sister sent me this, she's like, hey, Ashley, you'll love this. And she sent me like these stickers. She sent me a picture of these stickers that they handed out at work. The managers all handed these out, where it says like angry, frustrated, upset, happy, embarrassed. And you're supposed to wear these on, like, stick them to your clothes. And she's got a big stack of them. They were all handed out. So when your emotion changes, you peel that off and stick another one on. And she was like, this is so creepy. And everybody was looking at each other like, this is weird. But the managers were all like, oh, this is so wonderful. We're breaking down barriers. We're removing the stigma. But of course, it's this trespassing into the private world, right? Before, you could go to work, do your job, put on a fake smile, and then go home. And that world, that private world of your home was yours, but also your internal world of your feelings about the situation was also yours. And what this does is it opens up that private world so that not only do you have to be exploited, you have to enjoy it. You have to really enjoy it. It has to be authentic. This demand for authenticity goes all the way down to the core. You have to really and truly believe it and if you don't, we will get you, but in the kindest way. And that's the thing. This is how power operates in society now. It's kindly power. It comes to you through this language of caring for the vulnerable, of supporting your feelings, of caring about your well-being, well, if you're unfortunate and you have a bad opinion and you're the villain, you're always villainized in relation to some putative victim that you're supposedly victimizing. So this makes power so much harder to fight against, because at least if you were getting beat over the head by a policeman, your mind is still yours, But now it's total. It reaches all the way inside your brain. And if you think about, not to be too Foucauldian, but like how power operates in society, it's always on the basis of the prison. Well, look at the prison now. How is power exercised in the prison? At the end of the day, yeah, they might beat, the power is underwritten by a beating. But for the most part, it's through this like wonderful, kindly power. Through you control yourself. If you do something wrong, everybody gets punished. It's not me. I didn't do it. It's because and teachers do the exact same thing. You probably had these progressive kind of teachers who they didn't slap you on the wrist or the hand or something like that. Instead, they said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We can't go out for recess today because Jimmy was chewing gum." And everyone goes, "Jimmy!" Ah. So we all control ourselves. We control each other. And it's through ostensibly the greater good, through appeal to some kind of greater good, some higher value. In COVID, we are invited to all police each other for the higher value of public health, because there are very few higher values on which we can all agree. And so this is what scares me is all of these trends, which were already in existence for a long time, have really gone into overdrive within COVID-19. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to dial back.
Yeah, another really interesting part of this, like, opening up of the private with the work atmosphere is the intrusion of, like, cultural education from like your bosses. I mean, with like Black Lives Matter and like other things, like I saw people posting like International Women's Day, how they're having like HR Zoom calls discussing how they can make things better. And it's kind of utilizing this discourse of we're going to have an open discussion to improve it, but it's also only up to liability, because if they say the wrong opinion, they get screamed at or in trouble from people who are their bosses but are pretending to be the pushers of like progressive causes or care of everyone.
Yeah, it's so clever. So incredibly clever. And I'm sure that they don't even realize that they do it. And I think that's the important thing to understand. Like, I think one of the most amazing things about understanding society is how little intention there is. Like, if you can easily go too far down, like, this is what happens. People go down the road of conspiratorial thinking because they imagine that everything has agency behind it, that somebody has a plan. But they don't, right? It's just interests at play, and it's in their interests. That's why they look at a discourse like that and they go, "Ooh, I love that." Why do they love that? Well, it means that they don't have to, like, pay people more or offer decent childcare at work or whatever. So when I say childcare, for example, this whole idea of like the gender pay gap that was like became a big issue on the public agenda a few years ago. And it became all about, it was transformed into discrimination. So discrimination came to be understood as the ultimate cause of all these inequalities. So essentially, at the end of the day, it's ideas inside people's heads, which is wonderful, because then you just buy this corporate responsibility program of, teaching workers how not to discriminate, and then all problems will be solved, right? So they basically say, it's not me. I'm not doing anything here. It's you people. You need to be taught how to behave. You have unconscious biases in your head, and that's why we have all of these inequalities, not me. So it's basically outsourcing blame for inequalities in society onto the working class, onto workers themselves. And of course, this means that they don't have to deal with other sorts of issues. So what I was talking about with the gender pay gap is it became about discriminating against women. So this idea of the motherhood penalty, as though someone becomes a mother and some guy that you're working with is like, "Oh, I'm going to dock your pay now." That's not how it happens, right? We have two conflicting ideas in society, two conflicting expectations. On the one hand, you have to be a really intensive parent. And everything that goes wrong in society is down to the parents. Where are the parents at? The parents are lazy. When, statistically, we spend way, way, way more time with our kids now than we did 50 years ago, which people are often surprised to learn, because there's a discourse in society that says parents need to spend a huge amount of time. They've got to be intensive. It's got to be expensive. The whole business of parenting is all very, very difficult. And if you screw up here, you're responsible. You're complicit for the failures of your children and the failures of society. And then on the other hand, you've got feminism, which is like, the measure of feminism is how many CEOs there are. Those two things do not go together. It's very, very difficult. And also we have a familialization of care. So it's your responsibility to care for children. And if you take your kids to daycare, or you do anything at all, like God forbid, take them to McDonald's semi-regularly to make the whole juggling act a little bit easier, you're complicit in obesity and this and that and that. And so a lot of women, how do they deal with that pressure? The cultural contradictions of motherhood, as Sharon Hayes called it, they work part-time.
Right. They
take a very, very long maternity leave. And that is something you're supposed to do. And if you don't breastfeed, which is enormously labor intensive, it's very, very difficult. If you don't do all that stuff, you're a bad mother, or at least you wind up having to do a ton of identity work. No, I tried, I did, but I couldn't, and so on. And so women will work less. And so as you move up after childbearing age, there are fewer and fewer women in higher positions. Like, I've noticed this too. I've got two small children, which I've had close together, so they're 2 and 4. My career has taken a massive, massive, massive hit. Humongous. Right. Because I'm just not able to travel at the drop of a dime now, whereas a man would, and it's not because of like misogyny in the culture or something like that. It's like, oh, that's your first priority, but your job is also your first priority. But in the culture, it's like, how dare you prioritize your job over a child? So it's the gender pay gap, just to give you an example, is a very, very complicated thing. Right. But the simple story, this tantalizingly simple story, is it's discrimination. And if we can stop people from discriminating against women, then these problems will go away. And isn't that wonderful for employers? Because it's nice and cheap, comparatively cheap, to buy in all these experts to give you unconscious bias training, as opposed to giving you decent childcare for free, which was what feminists had actually always fought for previously.
So, I mean, it is interesting, I guess, to look at it from all the angles which kind of reinforce each other. And I do wonder about the shift in, responsible parenting being very involved, turning into, a kind of a style of schooling, those horrifying progressive teachers you mentioned. And then translating into the workplace as well, and kind of always wanting, I guess, put it this way, employees asking for their companies to make statements or to condemn, say, white supremacy as a force external to the company or to the company's activities. But we here at Microsoft or whatever, we condemn white supremacy. Or how much do you think there's a sort of push and pull there? Because it does feel like there's a new generation of workers for whom the idea that you would just turn up to work and grin and bear it, and that's not enough anymore. It's they want to work in a place that values them and values them as an entire person. So it feels like the intrusion of the private is both sort of invited and then foisted upon workers. Do you think that's the case, or was one sort of prior to the other?
That's a good question. There's something that I noticed as well, where younger people don't want to work for a capitalist either. It's almost seen as immoral to work for someone else's greed. I've heard that a couple of times. And I found that interesting. So it's like we're unable to understand or reject capitalism in a meaningful way. So in our own personal capacities, we will act out of rejection so that I am not tainted by it. I'm not really part of this because I work for an NGO and I'm trying to do good in the world, even though you are, because obviously it's indirectly going to be funded by capitalism. So I think that's part of it, that, if I'm going to take part in this awful system, I at least want it to reflect that I am not this I am not this greedy person. I am not complicit in the values of capitalism, and nor is the company that I work for, because we're going to put out this statement. So I just had a meeting with somebody who's the head of this big, like trading firm. I don't know, because I'm doing some research for British Academy. So I've been looking at like therapeutic entrepreneurs and how it works in companies and that kind of thing. So I've been doing these interviews, and it was very interesting because she said, it's so strange because the object of our organization is to make money. That's what we exist for. We exist for no other reason but to make money. And pretty much every other company also exists only to make money, because if you don't, you're going to go out of business. And maybe for a short period of time, you can not make a lot of money. Like if you've got a monopoly or something, maybe you can afford to sacrifice some of your profits. But if you're working in a competitive area, you need to have make profits in order to reinvest. And also sometimes you have a legal obligation to pay your shareholders, right? She says, but the crazy thing is that I can't say that. I'm not allowed to say that. So when every year I have to meet with this board, I don't know who it was, I have to look at my notes again for the details. But anyways, she says to talk about what our goals are, our objectives are for the next year. And she says, obviously my objective is to make a lot of money, make more money than our competitors, so that we can continue to exist. And she says, but I can't say that. So I have to make up all this stuff about how we're like furthering these objectives and so on. And I just thought, and she did say like, okay, there are some people who are absolutely ruthless and will do anything, right, to make that money. And you want to avoid doing that. Obviously, as a human being, that's what you want to do. But why are they so ruthless? Because they know if they don't do it, they'll go out of business. Right? They won't be able to compete. And it's not because they're jerks. It's like, oh, I just wasn't aware that this was unethical. Like they know full well what they're doing. But it struck me that we're kind of living in this collective delusion where it's like, okay, we can't really change this world. There is no alternative. This is the way things are. But we can tell ourselves a nice story about it. And in so doing, we can say, at least I am not complicit. At least I am not to blame.
Yeah, it's sort of... It reminds me of, I guess, another sort of topic we wanted to touch on, but the connection is interesting. I was thinking about social media companies and media companies in general. And given that we're all, stuck in a sort of alienated hell world, and then that heightened by lockdowns and things, all our sort of speech and communication being moderated by a fairly small set of media and tech companies who... clearly are beholden to their advertisers almost entirely, but have decided, or have on behalf of their users decide that they are the arbiters of truth and what constitutes violence, right? That speech is violence, and there's this kind of left mode of, you're not taking my trauma seriously unless a tech company sort of really enforces a terms of service violation against those who might devalue that experience.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a sort of muddled question, but only to ask, that mode of engagement, there's a capitalist motive behind it, but yet again, everyone sort of pretends this is just a culture issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Have you sort of observed that people often like to indict academia, particularly for this like speech is violence, trauma, politics mode. Do you think it's coming out of the academy, or is it something deeper?
It's a good question. I mean, a big part of it comes from academia in that you have to, there's an enormous need just in order to like keep your job and progress to create problems and promise solutions to the problems that you dream up. And this filters out into the world. And it's hard to say whether or not the demand was there to begin with that academics just kind of rose to. And it's not just academics, it's like lobby groups, activists, psychologists, basically the knowledge class generally, or this whole kind of, you could expand it, this whole kind of social problems class, who have an economic and personal motive to dreaming up problems and offering solutions. I guess you could say that they're complicit in it. And also they they create the issues to begin with. So it's, I wouldn't say that there's like a demand in society for unconscious bias training, right? There's like, and in fact, often when you study these issues, the first claims that these lobby groups and activists and so on make are not that they have a solution to a problem that already exists. They are creating an issue. They initially campaign that this is a problem everyone should accept, and conveniently, here's my solution. They already have the thing that they're hoping to peddle, and so they're creating the problem. And you can see this like all the time, because you have to show impact in what you're doing. Like philosophy can't just, if you're in a philosophy department, you can't just sit there and dream up all sorts of interesting questions. And I think a lot of students who do PhDs, once they get into academia, they're all very disappointed that actually it's not you just walking through a forest thinking, looking at the trees. You have no time to do that. It's, through this sort of proletarianization of the academy, you are teaching like 8 classes, and if you don't get 150,000 pounds of funding, you're out the door. And you're in a philosophy department, which literally does not cost 150,000 pounds to do research, but people have to dream up some purpose. So I was just at this conference last week where we had, not at it was like a virtual conference, and it was a bunch of philosophers who were trying to demonstrate the impact of what they do. And it was amazing to me, because they were all like, we had this whole conversation about the profit thing, where I was like, I basically said what I said, at the end of the day, companies need to make a profit. And everyone looked at me like I was horrible. How dare you say that? Companies have all kinds of different values. All we have to do is try to convince them to focus on different values than just profit. And trying to be nice, but I burst into laughter. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But so they disregarded me. I'm this weird Marxist over there, and we're talking amongst themselves. I can't be nice. I'm bad. Anyways, but it was interesting because this one woman put forward. She said, "What we really need to do is we need to teach companies ethical values. We need to set up these training programs where we bring to them the great ethical traditions of mankind." And again, totally flippin' useless, but I imagine 5 years from now, workers will be like, "What's this? I have to take a philosophy class? And when do I have to have this done by?" "Yeah, it's mandatory training. You need to take this class on ethical values, and you got to get it done by Tuesday." "By Tuesday, but I have that big project due." "Well, better work till 10 o'clock then." And it just perfectly lays bare the kind of situation that we're in. So there's this enormous market for these totally useless solutions, where we can all just dream that the solutions are simple and the problems don't actually exist.
So the aspect of like the speech and being violence and big tech is, since we're all online more and more of our lives now, because we're all trapped inside for the most part still, we've seen kind of a rise in censorship of the problematic, whether it's like COVID, conspiracy, or suspicions. Like there's been documentaries swiped from the internet. There's the Hunter Biden pictures that are just like, we get people banned from Twitter. Basically anything that was considered problematic, even like stuff in regards to like QAnon. But it seems this is kind of accelerating like paranoia of the system in a way that's not productive. We've seen like QAnon rise, and we've seen like protests worldwide of like people tired of lockdowns, because every new 2 weeks we get new instructions of how to do it. It's 2 masks or no masks, or just get the vaccine, but once it's 80%, now it's 100%. It's like we're not allowed to question anything, and it seems it's just making people more paranoid and resentful of the system, which is making people less likely to actually follow any guidelines. Like, what do you see? Like, how do you see this going forward? Do you think it'll like get better once we have more openness in society, or we can just talk to face, or do you think we're just going to see a further acceleration of like restriction of what is allowable speech, even if it's may seem crazy to most people?
Yeah, I think we are going to see an acceleration of restrictions because they predate the pandemic. and are partially the result of some trends that just accelerated because of the pandemic. So in general, we don't really trust people to be able to hear things and judge for themselves what they think, because, well, people will get it wrong sometimes. That's the price of living in a free society. You can't control what people think. You can't. And the fact that people get it wrong sometimes, you'll be like, sort of like lift up the absolute worst examples as the, well, this is the what it's like for everybody, right? Even though the fact that it's so extreme is the reason why you hold it up, because most people are horrified by it. Like, what? You believe that there's like a blood drinking cult at the center? And like the reason why it makes the news is because it's so crazy. But there's this general sort of trend toward not trusting people. And actually that not trusting people and calling them stupid and deplorable and so on actually drives people into these pockets anyway, to begin with. It drives people to distrust institutions, who demonstrably hate them. And so once you're already out of mainstream society, it's quite easy to fall down that kind of rabbit hole. But in general, we basically take the worst case scenario, the worst possible, most uncharitable view of human beings, and democratize that to the whole of the population. And you can see that with a lot of trends. We think that we've done away with prejudice and sexism and so on, but even in these kinds of movements, but all that we've done is democratize the worst things to the whole of the population. So it's like, 200 years ago, they would be like, oh, man is rational and reasonable and capable of democracy, except for those men. They're not really men. They're like animals, and they're not capable of democracy. Ew. But men are, good and capable of democracy, and they would exclude these people. And now, instead of being like, oh, actually, everybody is rational, reasonable, we're all able to, live in a democracy, it's like, everybody's an animal, everybody's irrational. So all these really racist ideas, we didn't do away with them, we just democratized them. That wasn't the goal. The goal wasn't to take those racist ideas and say, oh, actually, I meant that for everyone. No, the best of what it could be, what human beings could be, was the injustice was that it was kept to a small group of people. And that's what was needed we needed to democratize that. You can see that for women as well. Like, for generations, feminists had fought against gender stereotypes, that women are body conscious, that we're overly emotional, and all of these things that were a reason to keep us out of public life. You can't have a woman president because she's going to have her period and hit the nuclear button and all this nonsense. And that was like a stereotype, right? And now it's like, oh, actually, it's so great that women are emotional and everybody should be like that. And I'm like, excuse me. It's incredibly insulting, right? And in a way, all of these ideas about what it meant to be human and how they excluded other people from that ideal of humanity were reasons to keep people out of public life, to keep people separate from democracy. And now what we're really saying is that nobody is suitable for a democracy. That everybody is in a way those kinds of those stereotypes, that this democracy was kind of like a wrong turn in a way.
Well, I feel like any time there's any advancement in the cause of an actual, people are capable of making choices about their own lives, communities are capable of actually deliberating in some sense, and perhaps making demands or attempting to improve things. We like to take things out of that realm as quickly as possible. And it seems like this discursive tricks that are pulled. And one of them, which I don't know if you sort of agree, is to, I think, make things sort of outside us and eternal. You would take it's both a personal responsibility doctrine because you're complicit in something like white supremacy or structural misogyny. But those things kind of exist both outside of us, and yet they're eternal, they're unchanging. You can never reform them, right? Because they're not us. And yet somehow we still are personally responsible for our participation in a quote unquote structural issue. Do you think that it feels like just a shell game to me? I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that's a trick that's pulled quite a lot, that every kind of social issue gets reified like that, where it's like, oh, well, it's just human nature, right? And ever it shall be. But of course, you always have to have like a space where supposedly people can do something, or else there's no point in the discourse. So you wind up having this kind of really contradictory discourse where it's like, oh, it's eternal, it's outside of you, but buy my 5-step program and you can buy your way out of this kind of sin. And it goes back, obviously it has that kind of like Protestant ethic to it as well, where it's like it's eternal, but there are things that you can do to show that you're one of the chosen ones. And I suppose that probably is rooted somehow in capitalism. I don't know, I haven't really thought about it, but in the same way that the Protestant ethic kind of rears its ugly head, I mean, and you can see it in this as well. There's always a space for the church, right? It's eternal, but hold on a second, I need some money. Buy this indulgence.
Yeah, if this kind of...
Sorry, I've just mixed up two different religions. We get the idea. I'm trying to say, like, eternal damnation, you can buy an indulgence, and the Protestant ethic, you can show that you were one of the chosen ones. Sorry, go on.
With this kind of like back and forth of like it's personal and structural, I think we've seen a lot of problematic ideas reemerging as progressive throughout the last few years of like, oh, like Black Lives Matter. You'll see a lot of people propose like policies that would require like a race signs, like, oh, if they're black, and it's like, okay, well, who decides who's black? Like, who draws the line of where these racial categorizations happen?
I've got some lovely calipers I can sell you if you want to.
Yeah.
But these kind of ideas that you're supposed to be fighting are actually just being reified in a progressive like manner, and it's unquestionable because if you do, you're racist or you're sexist or you're a settler colonialist or something. How do you think we get through that? Because like it seems like with so many people, especially those in the liberal HR kind of sphere, there's just an unquestioning respect for authority, and like even if it's horrible regressive ideology.
Yeah, I mean, how do we move beyond that is really, really difficult. I mean, I think it's in part of it is to lay bare what it is. So, for example, when something sounds so good, it lulls you to sleep, And I think that's the way a lot of these kinds of claims work, where it's just the person is just bombarding you with all these nice sounding things. And it's like, you wouldn't kick a puppy. Oh no, I'm not going to kick a puppy. No, of course not. And it's like, well, yeah, as a good person, you should be on board with this. And you're like, well, I'm a good person. And you just little by little, you find yourself on this train. But then to point out that actually there's continuity here with all the horrible things that these people supposedly are rejecting. And just to give an example of this, the most recent paper that I published is on discourses of Indigenous parenthood. And it was something that I noticed 10 years ago almost. God, I'm getting old. I went to a conference, and I was like, it's like Indigenous, it was like First Nations information governance, where it was like this thing where Indigenous people are sick of being studied, like lab rats basically, and we don't have any control over that data, what happens to it, right? And so it was all this talk about, okay, well, how do we do this research and how do we do it around this like information governance so that the people have access to the data that you're creating and so on. And it was just basically the whole conference was like how to get around this resistance, which is seen as totally totally understandable.
Oh.
But how do we get around it so that we can intervene in families? Because of course the problems are all in families, right? It's this cycle of reproduced social problems, and if we can just break the cycle. And I realized, I was like, this sounds familiar. And so I went and I picked up some of these documents, and I started to collect some documents over the years, and then finally I had the time to do a proper analysis of them. And it was amazing because the language was so kind and so deferential and so flattering, it was like, we're so sorry for everything that we did in the past. All the problems on reserve are because of the Canadian government and their colonial policies of the past and child removals and all the terrible things that they did. But what's the mechanism? What was the mechanism for why this causes problems today? It disrupted the relationship between generations. So mothers are no longer able to mother their children. And at the end of the day, bad parenting, our fault, is the result of all of these social problems. So we need to intervene to reinvigorate traditional Indigenous culture. And what's traditional Indigenous culture? Conveniently, a kind of globalized version that is basically a globalized, intensive parenting that I was talking about, localized so it sounds Indigenous. So it's like, all the 4 directions are very important to you, right? Of course. And, it's just like preconception, conception, parenting, whatever. Because what's mainstream policy obsessed with? The first 3 years. And it keeps going further and further back into preconception and like monitoring women's bodies who have the ability to get pregnant, right? Because women's wombs are continuously seen as the source of social problems. And do you know what they used to say? What did the colonial government used to say? Why did they take kids away? Because the Indigenous woman is incapable of raising a good liberal citizen. So we have to take her kids away. In order to make good liberal citizens. Now, yes, it's the Canadian government. In the past, because we took your kids away, sorry about that, now we have to take your kids away. But these are 2 totally different things, I swear to God, because look how nice we are, and look how we're apologizing. And so we have a situation where we have, like, I think it's like 80, I can't remember what it is. Indigenous children make up like 52% of children in care, in spite of making up something like 7% of the population of children. So there's this continuity there, but what's disarming is how kind it is. It's just neocolonialism with this kind of kindly face. And of course, colonialism always had that kindly face, right? It wasn't that, like, yeah, they said things like savages and so on that are hurt our ears now, but they wanted to save our souls. They were in it because they thought that they were doing something good. And I think often we think, oh, well, people have good intentions, so it must be good. No, the road to hell has always been paved with good intentions. It's actually worse. Like, I would much prefer someone to be evil and know that they are doing something evil. At least they would be stopped by their own conscience, right? It's like that famous quote, they'll never stop because they hound us with the blessing of their conscience. So they think that because they truly believe that they're doing something good by coming in and taking our kids away, and they truly are sorry to do it, it makes it very hard to fight against it, because it's not an obvious policeman beating you over the head. The policeman's like, it's in your head. And Indigenous people will say this themselves. I asked my aunt once when I was young, why have we got all these problems? Why does the reserve have so many problems? She says, oh, Ashley, we never learned how to be mothers. It's like, and that's just something that we repeat all the time. But that is a story that's told about why we have problems, because the material problems of reserves, they're far from city centers, there's no infrastructure. These have proved to be wicked issues. And so we've psychologized the issues and made them about parenting and family life, just like we do with the poor elsewhere. When there are wicked issues, we continuously individualize them. We go deeper and deeper. Sorry, I'm talking for a long time, but just to give you like an example of how this discourse works, it's like a game of musical chairs, right? You're like, you're playing musical chairs, the music stops, somebody gets left out. And you go, well, why did you get left out? Oh, I tripped and fell. Okay, well, let's play the game again. This time we'll make sure that you don't trip and fall. Okay, so we play the game again, music stops, someone gets left out. Well, geez, we made sure you didn't fall this time. Well, what happened? Oh, I wasn't as fast as the other people. Okay, this time we'll give everybody training on how to be a fast runner. Play the game again, someone gets left out. Geez, why did you get left out? Well, I don't know. Maybe it was my parents. Let's do a brain scan. Yep. And sure enough, you might find that there's some difference inside these people's brains that make it that that's the person who got left out. But at the end of the day, someone was going to get left out. So we become more, because we're unable to deal with these problems, we look deeper and deeper inside of individuals. And how we combat against that is to lay bare what it is, to point out that behind all this kind rhetoric is the same old story being told, that ultimately the problems are between your ears. Ultimately, the problems are inside the working class, not the system.
Yeah, this indigeneity language used for like maniacal projects seems to be taken on more and more. We'll see like the Democratic Party or like things like anti-extractivism or imperialism, be like, oh, well, it's for the indigenous population, or it's because indigenous people want to be one of the land, and then we should do that as well. That's why we're gonna like stop mining and stuff like that. And they'll justify it by like, oh, I'll have the native land in my bio, and I'm identified as a white settler. But I just want to know like what you kind of make of that. Like, it seems this idea of the settler colonial is like the new like in vogue idea to like shut down people, like especially like the Marxist left, because like, oh, well, they don't talk about settler colonialism enough, which I don't think is true, but it seems this is very in vogue to like utilize indigenous struggles despite no one being indigenous using or saying these things.
Well, there are a lot of like middle class indigenous people. Like I could see myself kind of on that trajectory because I came from like quite a difficult background, and I wanted out of that because who wants to live like that? It's not nice. It's terrible. And as I went through my education, I was like, I got this scholarship for, Indigenous young people. And I could see that it was, there was like this award ceremony where they gave me this scholarship and they were like recruiting me, which of course obviously comes with it. But it was like, what were they recruiting me for? It was so that they could have an Indigenous face for their policy. Right. And so it's not like white people going in and giving you parenting classes. It's an Indigenous person, it's an insider, that kind of thing. And so like there's a lot of people that do that, they're Indigenous and they have these kinds of ideas of like the noble savage, and they totally imbibe it. And like I understand it too, because I'm sad about the loss of culture. Like it makes me sad that my great aunts and uncles were probably the last people to have Ojibwe as their native language. It makes me sad to lose a lot of that culture that I grew up with. It makes me sad that to talk about dreams and that kind of thing is just like a weird thing that I can only talk to my family about. But at the end of the day, I recognize that's terrible politics, a very, very bad basis for politics, highly romantic, backward looking, understandable because it's the pain of the loss, right? You lose something beautiful, but you can go back to the past. And in fact, trying to do so is horrific and was the source of a lot of like the worst movements of the 20th century. These kind of like blood and soil ideas of like ethnicity attached to the land. And it's basically nationalism with a kind of pseudo-progressive twist. And of course, it like reifies all these ideas of Native people being like slaves to culture, and not being like having diversity of opinion. So like my brother was like pro pipeline, in spite of being Indigenous, because he's poor and he wants money and he needs a job. And so he has particular material interests, just like the rest of the working class. He's not like separate from everybody else because of his like religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs or whatever. It's this idea that like because you're an Indigenous person, you're like a slave to your spirituality and that dictates everything in your life. That's absolutely not true. You're also a human being. And to deny people their individuality used to be a key form of racism. And now it's like a key progressive idea that because you come from a certain background, you're supposed to have certain beliefs. And to recognize different backgrounds is to recognize a monolithic belief system, which is racist.
In terms of, I guess, some of that repackaging of sort of the, essentially a liberal dogma, but wrapping it in like here's an Indigenous version we shall gift to you. I feel like there's maybe a similar kind of thread to pull on in terms of how people sort of ventriloquize the working class or romanticize the working class. But I guess sort of as an rough attempt to close on a hopeful note. I mean, what do you think about sort of building working class power today? I mean, like, it seems like there's many roadblocks to it, and there's many sort of traps to fall into. But surely it's the only way, right? I mean, surely it's all we can do. So I guess I'm asking in a roundabout way. I mean, where do you see the opportunity to kind of build that power?
I think I'm always going to be on the side of material progress as having the potential to free people, and ensuring that that we have to kind of band together in favor of our material interests, or else we'll get swept behind. The wheel of history will just roll right over us. And I think what's happening with a lot of the culture war, while it's really, really important to, fight against misanthropy, it's really important to fight against authoritarianism, creeping authoritarianism. We're often being invited to think that actually the real battles are cultural, and that's all that really matters. And really, who wants all that icky money anyway? And really, society's gone too far, and we need to go back. That's the really regressive kind of movement in society, I think, that needs to be opposed, because we have to continuously fight against forces in society that will try to impoverish us, that will try to make our work precarious, that will use automation, which ought to be a freeing force on human beings, saves us from toil. Within capitalism, turns around and controls us, turns us into precarious workers, cogs in a machine, that kind of thing. But if you have that kind of organization, you can push for a better deal every single time. But if we don't have that, capitalism will just keep doing its worst, and we won't be able to find a way out of it. What scares me is that capitalism is changing. It's ever moving. It's not like, if we don't do anything, it'll just be this and this forever, right? Which is why I think I confuse people, in terms of my politics, because I don't feel the need to sit there and talk about how capitalism is evil. Because I don't think that I don't think I need to tell people that it's evil in order to get a critical movement in society. And also, you're just kind of lying, because it's been a force for progress in enormous numbers of ways. And to deny that, people just look at you like, are you insane? Are we living in the same world here? It's not going to last forever. It can't last forever. It will be brought down by its own contradictions, as the famous phrase goes. But that doesn't mean that we inevitably move to something better. No, we could move to something much, much worse. And that's what scares me. And if we aren't aware of the forces of history, if we don't understand the economy, we will never be able to take hold of it. We will never be able to control history. And I think that it was that kind of optimism of progressives of the past that's missing now, and that we need. That even in the darkest moments, when people seem totally determined by fate, when Marx is writing, they could still see the potential to understand and fight it. And only through understanding the forces of history that seem to be determining it can we determine our own history, to determine and take hold of the future. So I think that is the whole point of building a working class movement, is ultimately to understand the world and to control it and to direct it to human ends, with the end goal of abolishing class, not romanticizing class like, it's so great to work at a cash register. It's like factory life is wonderful. It's that nobody wants to do that. Nobody was born and begins to talk at the age of 5 and is like, I want to be a factory worker. Like, I want to work at a cash register. Like, these things can all be automated out of existence and free people to do all sorts of things, whatever they want to do. Sit on their ass, play video games, all the way up to make wonderful art and share it with whoever wants it. But we'll only ever have that by becoming conscious of that as the goal and trying to figure out a way to make it real, to make it exist. And only through understanding and trying to rationally direct the forces of history can we overcome the problems of today.
Well said. Actually, this is pretty much the time we have. Wanted to make sure people can find more about you or hear more about anything you're working on or anything excited about right now.
Right now I'm just trying to escape my enormous teaching load. Not that there's anything wrong with teaching. I love it. I love engaging with students, but I just I feel like I'm I haven't been as active as I would like to be. But you can follow me on Twitter, and you can read some of my stuff on ResearchGate, and read my scholarly stuff. I also write for a variety of mainstream publications, and hopefully we'll be able to do a little bit more than that if I can figure out a way, I don't know, to eke out some time in this institution of the great factory that has become the university.
Well, may your toils end. Thank you so much, Ashley. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.